All right, let's talk about the history of CSS a little bit. And this can be understood if you go back in time. Initially, websites were very simple, simple HTML, and maybe you added some CSS, light CSS on top to make things look pretty. Things evolved, and later as the website got more complicated, they used table to organize. Some developers use tables to organize where things should be placed. So they would create a bunch of rows, bunch of columns, and combine some rows, combine some columns to say, hey, let's put this content over here, put this content over here, and so forth. That was back in the old days. No one lays out the website using table anymore, thank goodness. It created a very messy HTML, and it just wasn't a good way of structuring things. But remember, in the early days, websites were used all by computers. And all these computers back then had limited screen resolution. So you built a website for a fixed width. You built it a fixed width for, let's say, 800 pixel, and then later 1024 pixel and 1280 pixel as the monitors got better and the resolution got higher. But the websites were almost always built for a specific width, right? Okay, so you can say back then, for example, 80% of the computers are using 800 pixel, so you would create a website that's optimized for 800 pixel and so forth. So making websites for fixed width was the thing. And they introduced some other CSS tags where you can align different items, vertically align them, stack them next to each other. But again, all of that was for a fixed width. Now, with the introduction of phones and tablets, now people aren't just using desktop or a laptop to access websites. Now they use iPads or iPhones or your Android phones to access a website. So now that required CSS to also be more flexible, right? So instead of making a website look just for a fixed width of 800 pixel or 980 pixel or 1024 pixel, now you wanted to make it more flexible and do things. And that introduced new concepts such as flex, grid design, which we'll cover. But in our course, before we introduce you to flex and grid, which is more advanced, and unless you have strong fundamentals, it can easily confuse you, we're going to have you focus on some of the traditional CSS so that you master that, you get more familiar, and soon we'll introduce flex and just a little bit of the grid CSS design so you can also get familiar. But with that history in mind, I think it's important for you to realize that CSS is evolving, right? Back 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, some of the CSS elements, styles that you're using didn't exist back then. Even now, there are new CSS syntaxes that are being introduced, but the problem is, notice that there are many different browsers and many different versions. Some of the browsers may not know how to use some of these CSS syntaxes because maybe there are standards, but sometimes there really aren't standards. And Firefox would support certain functionalities where Chrome doesn't, and Internet Explorer or Edge or whatever maybe the browsers that other customers are using, maybe they don't support that. So what is important with the CSS is that not only you understand the history, but you don't get too ahead of yourself. There may be some new CSS styles that come out, but look, it may not be supported across major browsers. So just because Chrome supports it, if Microsoft Edge doesn't support it, do you just go in and use that anyway? And then do you create another CSS file per different browsers or per different versions? That becomes a nightmare. So again, with CSS, and this is applicable across many technologies, is you don't want to get too hooked to the hype. Because again, many browsers and many different operating systems may not be able to support that. This is why 10 years ago when I taught CSS, I didn't teach some of the CSS things that are being taught now, because now majority of the browsers and phones and tablets have adopted a lot of the CSS, but 10 years ago it was different. Every browser had different syntaxes, and to do one thing, maybe you had to write 10 lines, one for Firefox, one for Chrome, one for Chrome version 10 plus, 10 minus, whatever. It got very complicated. So in this course, we're going to focus on some of the CSS syntaxes that are most fundamental, that are supported across major browsers. But again, have in mind that if you read online some of the other cool, fancy CSS syntaxes, you should be thinking, I wonder if all browsers support this. And I'll put a link where you can see, can I use this particular CSS syntax? And you can see what browser supported, what version supported, what percentage of the people in the world are still using that browser. You might be surprised, so that you can think twice before you use some of the fancy CSS syntaxes. But again, we're going to try to focus on some of the fundamentals.